Welcome to our Data Bytes workshop, getting started with OpenRefine. OpenRefine is a software tool that we use for cleaning messy data. It is free, open source. You can access it from a website for download. We'll talk about that. It is better for data cleaning than spreadsheet programs like Excel. It is not as powerful as tools like R or Python, but it is easier to master. It works best with spreadsheets and tables of data, and usually in formats such as Excel, TSV, CSV. It can find errors and inconsistencies in bulk without having to go cell by cell. It lets you look at large data sets, get an overview of them, split or join them, and then export the modified data without changing your raw data. And it allows you to enhance data with data from other sources, such as from websites. The lesson that we're going to look at is available through the Carpentries website, and the URL there at the bottom is the one where you are able to find this entire lesson. The library carpentry lesson starts with instructions on how to download OpenRefine, and you go to this URL and click on that. It takes you to this, and you select which version of OpenRefine you need based on your operating system. OpenRefine requires Java to be installed. So if you do not have Java on your device, you'll need to download that as well. And you should download the most current version, which is 3.4.1. That's the version that we will be talking about. This is some additional information. If you have any problems downloading, this is help troubleshooting. And there's also a wiki that's included with the lesson with some additional information. Once you have it downloaded, you should have two things. You should have a user window that looks like this, which opens up in your browser. But you should also have the program itself running in the background. So this window must stay in your toolbar, and then we will work from here. The next step is to choose your data file, and I had previously downloaded the data file to my desktop. So we'll open it, and you see that the title of the file appears here, and then we'll hit next. It's going to upload the data and give you a preview of what this data set looks like in OpenRefine. And once we've determined that, yes, this is in fact the data set that we want, then we need to go down here and look and be sure that we have the right boxes checked. It is a CSV file. That's how we're going to, that agrees with the file that we uploaded. This version of OpenRefine allows you to check this box for trimming leading and trailing white spaces. So that right there cleans up quite a bit of data. And we had only one column as or one row as column headers. If you have multiple rows as column headers, you may want to change that. And we will use the character shown to separate columns. And the one thing you don't want to do is check the parse cell text into number and dates, because that's part of what we will be doing as we work through cleaning our data. So the next thing we want to do is create a name for our project. And so I'm just going to call this OpenRefine workshop. And use an underscore between that. If I wanted to tag it to make it easier to find later, I could add some keywords or tags there. And now we hit create project. And after we do that, we get this spreadsheet format. And we have a total of 10 columns. Up here at the top, you see that we can show this data either as rows or as records. Actually, in this case, that doesn't show up as being different because each row is a record, but we'll show how that can be useful later. And we also can decide how many rows we want to look at one time. If we want to make it a little easier, a little cleaner, we can just say we're going to only look at 5 rows. Okay, so now our next thing is to look at some of the functionality of OpenRefine. And one of the things we want to do is to look at the tops of each column. We have these arrows, and you'll see these different selections. And we will look at these in more detail. And each one of these has that drop-down menu. And then we also are able to recognize that we can, if we select this, we can work on all of our columns at one time, but most of the time what you're going to be doing is selecting one column to work on. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to select our authors column. And if we look at the authors, we see that although there are multiple authors, each of them, all of them are shown in one cell. So let's look at how we could break those authors out into separate cells. So we could go down here and we could choose edit cells and go down to split multi-valued cells. So before we do that, let's look at one more thing, and that is, let's look at how the authors are separated. They are separated with something called a pipe, and the pipe is the straight up and down version of a slash. And a pipe on your keyboard you can find by hitting Shift and going to a backslash. Okay, so yeah, let's go ahead and edit our cells. Split multi-valued cells, and it asks us what separator we're going to use. And so we do that. We hit Shift and enter the pipe to tell it that that's what our separator is. And when we do that, we see that our authors are now separated into different cells. So if we look at the rows, whereas before it was 1001, I think, it is now 4009. So let's go back and look at records. Yeah, 1001. And we see that the records haven't changed. What has changed is that now we have split our authors into separate rows. Okay, so that's the value of being able to look at rows versus records. All right, so now let's say we've changed our mind. We want to go back. We're going to put our cells back the way they were. And so now we'll just reverse this by going to join multi-valued cells and do the same thing. It asks, what do you want to use as a separator? And we're going to tell it what we want to use a pipe. So you might have the question, well, why do we use pipes? And in this case, it's because pipes are easier to be clear about what your separator is. If you use something like a comma, then there are cases where your names may be listed as last name, first name, with the comma in between. And if you have shown that the comma is your separator, it'll confuse OpenRefine, and it will separate the names into, the first names and the last names in separate boxes, which is not what we want. Okay, so now we have put our cells back the way we want them. So let's look at another way of grouping our data. we are going to use something called facet. And a facet is a way of grouping common entries. And this is where we get into something that is quite useful for cleaning up data. So the first facet we're going to use on the publisher column. And we go up here and we see that facet is our first choice. There are a number of different types of facets, but the first is a text facet, and that is probably the one that is used most commonly. So we use our text facet on our publisher column, and we see that when we do that, now there were 7 choices, 7 facets. And we can see that the facets are sorted at the moment by name, but we can also sort it by count. And when we do that, we see that we can figure out which one has the most values. So International Union of Crystallography has 858, MDPI, AG 93, and so on. And you'll notice that down at the very bottom is another MDPI AG. So this is where the faceting tells you that there's something different about this version of MDPI AG than about this one. And if you look at it very carefully, you can see that there appear to be 2 spaces here and only 1 space here. So let's go ahead and put the facets back by name, and let's look at what happens if we group these. So let's select that one, and then we go down here and say, I want to include this as well, and look at these 2 together. And when we do that, and look over here at our publisher column, now our facet has excluded all of these other values. These are the only ones that we would see. And so 93 plus 3 is 96. And if we look up here, we see that we have 96 matching rows. So any work that we do is now being done exclusively on these 2 facets, okay? And you should remember that, because it's very easy to perform an operation on a facet and forget that you have not performed it on all of them. And you can get several steps down the road before you realize that you don't have your whole data set. So that's something to be aware of. So we're not going to do anything with this at the moment. We'll do that a bit later. We're going to close this, and now we're back to our 1001 rows. So let's look at a couple of other types of facets, and let's look at language. Okay, so let's do a text facet on language. And now our facets are over here on the side again, and we see we have EN is 871. And we have English spelled out, which is 107. The other 2 values are also the 2-letter codes. So it seems likely that what we want to do is to convert this facet to look like this one. So let's select the EN, and then let's also include the English spelled out. And now what we can do is we can go and we can edit, okay? So we're going to edit. And when we do this, we just enter EN and apply. And now that collapses so that now both those facets are now a single facet. And we see that 978 is now the single facet. And there was a message up here that told you what you did, okay? All right, so we've made that edit, and so now we're going to get rid of this facet. Let's look at a couple of other types of faceting. One of them is called a duplicates facet. And so let's just look at authors and see if we have any duplicates. So a duplicates facet is here under customized. And if we select that, you see that in the side column, we have true and false. And what that tells us is that in the names column, 802 of the values are unique, and 199 of them, there are duplicates. So if you are interested in identifying data sets or records potentially that are duplicated, if you, for instance, were looking at DOIs, you might use this to identify the duplicates and remove them. And another type of facet that we can look at is faceting by blank. So let's use the DOI and let's go to customized facets. And if we go down here, you see that we have the choice of null, empty string, or if we choose facet by blank, it'll pick up either null or empty string. And so what we see is, again, we have 978 that are false because they are not blank, but we have 23 that are blank or have zeros. And so if we look at these, sure enough, we find that these 5, or we can look it up to 50. Let's see what happens. Let's look at 25. And that shows us that we have 23 that have blank in the DOIs. There are no DOIs. Okay, so the next thing, let's look at if we wanted to use an algorithm or clustering to be able to look at subtler differences than a facet, then how would we do that? Well, first of all, let's look at how we would get to a cluster. And we're going to choose our authors and just facet on that. And you notice up here that we have a button for clustering. And so first you have to facet to be able to use a cluster. And actually, this was not a good choice because those, I did not have them separated out, so it's difficult to do that. So instead, let's go back to our publishers. Let's facet those. Go back to the text facet on our publishers that we've already looked at. And let's go to cluster. And what we see is that by clustering, it picks up that MDPI AG, similar but not the same. And how do we do that? Well, we use what's called an algorithm, and it has a couple of different algorithms you can choose, and you can look and see whether using a different algorithm makes a difference in the values. And in this case, it does not. ppm presumably is for using with numbers, but in some cases, you may want to play a bit to see whether or not you've found all of the ones that are identifiable using a cluster. Okay, so if we say merge, then it's going to take both of these and combine them. And it will combine them by using the one that has the most values and defaulting and assuming that that is the correct one. So in this case, we're pretty sure that's right. And so we're going to do that, merge selected and recluster. And when that happens, now all of a sudden there are no clusters because it hasn't identified any others. So we can close that. So that's how we use clustering. We're going to look at a couple of other things to make it easier to work with large data sets. So when you are only interested in a few of the columns, one thing you can do is to use the all and then go to edit columns. And you may just say, some of these are not useful and you want to get rid of them entirely, or you may just want to be able to put them in a different order. So for instance, let's say we want the author and the subject to come after that. We want to look at the DOI and the ISSNs together, and the URL date is not terribly useful, so we're going to move that to the bottom, and the license. Okay, and by doing that, now we just say okay, and it completely reorders these columns. You can also do the same thing if you want to change the name of a column. And so I happen to notice that I want to change the name of the column here because it says license, and I'm going to assume that's a British spelling, but it doesn't look right to me. So instead, I'm going to edit. Let's see if I can remember how to do this. Facet. Yeah, let's see. Go back here and edit cells. Or edit column, probably edit column. Rename this column. Here we go. Okay, so I'm just going to change the spelling and make it SE and okay. And when I do that, now the column is LICENSE. All right, now we're going to introduce another way of using OpenRefine that is very powerful. And this is transformations. And this is when you need to make a lot more sophisticated changes to your data. And this is not something we are going to go into in depth today. If you expect to use OpenRefine and are interested in learning more ways to use the powerful features of OpenRefine, I encourage you to look at the second workshop in this series, and transformations will be a major part of that. So transformations can do some things that clustering and faceting and filtering cannot do, including if we, for instance, had a column that had addresses, and it was the complete mailing address, and you wanted to be able to separate it out by, say, zip code, separate the zip codes out, or actually separate the columns so that the address was broken up into street addresses, states, countries, zip codes, etc. Then faceting would be the best and easiest way to do that. Standardizing formatted data without changing values, faceting is very useful for, or extracting data from a string, such as if you have bibliographic data and you want to be able to pull the ISSN out, faceting is useful for that. And faceting is something that uses I'm sorry, I said faceting, I meant transformation. Transformations use a separate, well, it can be done with the drop-down menu, but it can also be done using a language, coding language called Grill. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. So let's start by looking at a column that we might want to transform. So let's just arbitrarily choose authors. And if we go to the edit cells and go to transform and click on that, this is what appears. And you'll see that there is a window where you can enter your value. And when you do that, the code must be in a standard format. So generally speaking, that format looks like this. value.function with parentheses, and the parentheses are what put in you can put in options. So the value is the is what you're going to act on. Function is what you're going to do to it, and then if there's details that need to be included, those go inside the parentheses. So there's also tabs here. You can take a look. This is previewing what the data looks like now, and so we haven't entered a function, so it's not making any changes to it. But if we did, this is where it would show up, and it would show you what that looked like. History tells you what you've already done. If you want to star one of these transformations that you created because you know you're going to use it, this would be where you would do that. And here is a help menu to explain some of these functions and the syntax. All right, so just for fun, let's go to cancel this and go to the publisher column. And we want to make a change to this so that we're going to change all the title, the case in each one of the publishers. And so to do that, well, first of all, let's back up a second. And let's say we want to change the cases of not all of them. We just have a couple we want to change. So we're going to facet it first. And then we're going to select this one. And we're going to select the Society of Pharmaceutical Technocrats. And if I haven't mentioned this already, you'll notice that when we have more than one of these facets we want to work on at a time, we click on include. So those are the two that we're going to make changes to. And so now what we're going to do is we are going to do what I tried to do earlier, which is we are going to go to here and edit cells and transform. Okay. And actually the other thing, so in this case, value to title case. So all the values we selected, and then to title case. Now, one thing to note is that OpenRefine is, at least, or GREL is case sensitive. And so if we didn't get that capital T under title case, it wouldn't recognize this. But it looks like, if you notice in the preview, we have the O in of is now capitalized. And if we go to Ashkantala Enterprises, don't see that it's made any changes, but it's already in title case. And so we can say OK, and it makes that change. And you see up here the message that tells you what you just did. It also, by the way, tells you that you can undo it. So it made a change to 6 of them, but you could undo it if you decided that isn't what you wanted to do. This seems like a good time to mention that there's another way to undo. And over here in your side pane, there is a selection called Undo Redo. And if we go to that, you'll notice that every step we have performed on this data set so far is listed. And at any time, if we decide that we made a mistake and that's not what we want, you just select the step before that operation and you go back to it. So if we do that with the transformation that we just did, you go over here, go back to that, and you'll notice that we have now undone our transformation. Okay, so let's look at transformations in another way. Let's go to edit cells, and you'll notice that underneath transform, there's also common transforms. So one thing that we could do is we could, again, if you want to do something that is a fairly common operation, we might do this. Let's go to title case for all of these. And you'll notice here, it makes a change to the MDPI because now it thinks only the first letters are supposed to be capitalized. And can look at some, actually, that's the other thing you can do is we can text filter. Let's do a text filter here. And let's say Ash Kantala. Hit the cap lock. Okay. If we say it's case sensitive, you see it does not find that. It also doesn't find it if you misspell it. So let's fix that. All right. But if we get rid of the case sensitive, okay. Didn't work. I must have still misspelled it. All right. Filtering allows you to find a value. And let's go back and look at our facets and see what that was. I got it backwards. Shantala is how it should have been spelled. So let's look at. All right, and there it is. Yeah. But again, if we do case sensitive, it says, no, don't see that. Okay. All right. Get rid of our facet. So that is as much detail as we're going to go into on using transforms today. But another thing to mention, again, if you are doing a transform and you want to be able to save it and repeat it on multiple different data sets, you may want to extract it. Okay, so we did a text transform here. Let's say I want to save that for future data sets, that because I know that I'm going to be performing similar operations. And so this is where we'd go. We would select, we would copy, and then we would save this to a text file. And so I did that previously and saved it to a file in Notepad. And this is what it would look like. And then the next time I had a similar data set, I would be able to just copy that and drop it into my transform window and apply it. Okay, so here, wrong. Let's go back to our text file. Closed it. Anyway, I would paste it in here, perform operations, and repeat the step. And finally, let's talk about exporting data. Now that we've got our data set all cleaned up, what I want to do is save it. Okay, so I would go in here to export, and I have the option of archiving my entire project, but and that would save all the steps and the operations that you did. But what I'm going to do at this point is save it as a CSV file. And so I would go to my, let's try that again, CSV file. Oh, yeah, it's down here at the bottom. Okay, open. And you'll see there's your file. And if I save that, it's got the same name that I gave the project. And so now I have that available to me to, my clean data. And with that, I will finish by encouraging you again to participate or watch the next week's workshop, where Clark will show you a lot of tricks and tips on how to use OpenRefine and use some of the more sophisticated transformations. And this will be a hands-on workshop, so please try to have your software downloaded and your data available and plan to follow along. Thank you for joining us.